Every Congress with newly elected people has a different personality.
From Washington's senior senator to the state's newest member of the congressional delegation, TVW is taking you behind the scenes in Washington, D.C. to see the new personalities and policies up close.
Because on a lot of these issues, we should be working together, and relationships are at the foundation of that.
But can lawmakers work across the aisle in the face of polarization and politics? How do you fix that?
Always be civil, always look for common ground. I also think that in many ways, frankly, the leadership has to start at the top, has to be a tone setting.
How members of Washington's delegation are trying to set an example and work towards common ground from Washington, D.C. to Washington State.
If I could quote a really good friend of mine, you in order to know where someone's coming from, you should see where they actually are coming from. Derek said that during the trip. And
he got tired of me saying it, I think.
well, I was able to memorize it.
But it's not just Congress. 3,000 miles away in Olympia, the legislature is also meeting. Democrats control both the House and Senate this year. In a one-party rule environment, can the two parties work together?
We've got to be listening to all of the views.
Well, and I think it's listening, but it's also action.
And what are the big issues facing state lawmakers?
Mental health and homelessness and drug addiction are all issues that we need to take on.
How are the priorities and agendas similar and different in this Washington and the other Washington? Also, how are women changing the face of Congress and the state legislature?
I look at the historic nature. You know, when I look at my mom, they didn't encourage women to work outside of the home.
And finally,
the budgets are very different.
A state and federal budget overview. From the capital of Washington State
to the capital of the United States,
this is Washington to Washington. Hello and welcome to TVW's new show, Washington to Washington. I'm Jennifer Huntley in Washington State.
And I'm Natalie Brandon, the other Washington, Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us as we launch this exciting show. We're going to be chatting cross-country and digging into the big issues, how they're being solved in both places.
We are planning episodes focused squarely on the issues facing both federal and state governments today, such as immigration, trade, healthcare, and education. We'll get into more about the show in just a moment, but first a bit about ourselves and our backgrounds in journalism. Natalie.
Thanks, Jennifer. I recently moved to this Washington from Washington State, where I was a political reporter covering big national issues from afar. Now that I'm here, I'm hoping to get a better up-close look at how Congress works and sometimes doesn't work, and particularly tracking the Washington delegation, their policy ideas, how they hope to solve some of the big challenges of our time.
For years, I worked in New Orleans, Louisiana, covering everything from hurricanes like the big one, Katrina, as well as the lively political climate down south. Here in Washington State, I created and served as the original host of TVW's weekly public affairs show, The Impact, and produced an education documentary called The Quest for Quality, detailing the state of education reform in Washington State after the passage of House Bill 2261 and the challenges facing districts as the state and courts addressed how to finance the measure. Natalie, I'm looking forward to working with you from 3,000 miles away.
That's right, Jennifer. We're really hoping to fill a void and better connect the federal side of politics with the state side of politics. So here we go. Hello from the nation's capital, where a new Congress is trying to solve some of the same challenges of last year, from immigration to trade tensions. Things got off to a contentious start in 2019 with a partial government shutdown impacting around 800,000 federal employees. The standoff playing out amid a divided government this year. Democrats took back control of the U.S. House. Republicans still control the U.S. Senate, slightly expanding their narrow majority there. The question as this year progresses, can they find compromise on the big issues? Before we dig into that question, let's take a closer look at your Washington delegation, beginning with the state's 2 senators. Washington's senior senator Patty Murray has served since her election in 1992. Senator Maria Cantwell elected in 2000. Both are Democrats, currently in the minority. The balance of power in the U.S. Senate is 53 to 47. The U.S. House has 435 members. After last November's election, Democrats hold the majority with 235 seats. Unlike the Senate, the number of Congress members is based on the population of a state. So based on its size, Washington state has 10 members, 7 Democrats and 3 Republicans after Republicans lost the 8th congressional district this past election for the first time since that district was created. The longest-serving member in this current delegation is Congressman Adam Smith of Western Washington's 9th District. He was first elected in 1996, and Smith this year became chair of the House Armed Services Committee. Another Washington chair, Derek Kilmer, who now heads a brand new committee to help modernize Congress. Washington's newest member is Dr. Kim Schreier, elected this past November to replace retiring Congressman Dave Reichert. Both of Washington's senators and 7 Congress members have also served in the state legislature, and we want to dig into the similarities and differences between the 2 Washingtons when we return.
First, let's return to Olympia, where the state legislative session has been underway since January 14th. This year, it's a long 105-day session because they have to write a new 2-year budget. Of course, that assumes they get everything done on time and don't have to call everyone back for a special session. Back in 2017, when control of the legislature was divided, they had to call 3 back-to-back special sessions and came within an hour of a partial government shutdown. This year, majority Democrats are vowing to get done on time. Here's a little background on the Washington legislature. There are 49 legislative districts in Washington. Each one elects 1 senator and 2 House members. In the Washington State Senate, Democrats hold 28 seats. Republicans have 20. But Democrat Tim Sheldon of Mason County caucuses with them, giving them 21 votes. Democrats regained control of the state Senate following a special election back in 2017. For several years before that, Republicans had control. Senate Democrats say they are being led by the most diverse leadership team in the history of the Washington State Legislature. Newly elected Senate Majority Leader Andy Billig from Spokane is joined by 2 new deputy leaders who are women with diverse backgrounds. Senator Manka Dhingra is the first Sikh woman elected to a state legislature, and Senator Rebecca Saldana is the only Latina in the chamber. The caucus chair is Senator John McCoy, a Tulalip tribe member. On the Republican side, Senator Mark Schessler from Ritzville is the chamber's minority leader. Of the 8 members on the Senate Republican leadership team, 6 are women. The Washington State House has 98 members, all of whom were up for re-election last November. Recently, longtime Speaker of the House Frank Chopp announced he will step down from his post after this session. He's the longest-serving Speaker in Washington history. State Representative J.T. Wilcox from Yelm was re-elected as House Minority Leader. In the 2018 election, House Democrats expanded their majority, winning 57 seats to Republicans' 41. That means that Washington State currently operates under a Democratic state government trifecta, with the Democrats in control of both the House and Senate, as well as the governorship. When we come back, we will go back to the nation's capital, where Natalie had a chance to sit down with some of Washington's delegation to talk about the differences between state and federal government, as well as a look at what some of our state's lawmakers are doing to increase bipartisanship in Congress.
In talking to Congress members who have served in both Washingtons, one key difference is the size and scale of the federal issues. Another big difference is the budget. An end-of-the-year funding fight spilled into the new year here in D.C., caused by sharp disagreement over border security funding and the president's calls for a border wall. This all came to a head after the White House and Congress missed its deadline in December to reach a solution and fund all agencies. But it's a problem we've seen before. We sat down with lawmakers at the end of the year before this shutdown began to talk to them broadly about this very issue.
Congress established in the 70s rules for budgeting and by and large ignores them. Under the Budget Act, it sets specific deadlines on when you have to have a budget and then when you have to have appropriations bills. And in modern history, almost without exception, Congress has always ignored it. That is not a costless problem, because what it means is, one, it creates tremendous uncertainty, not just for federal agencies and for federal workers, but also for even for private industry. When we have a government shutdown, that doesn't just affect federal agencies and federal workers. When you shut down the national park for 17 days, one of the small hotel operators in Clallam County said to me, a year later, we were still trying to dig out financially because we had 17 days worth of cancellations of people who would have otherwise gone to visit the national park, who instead canceled, and we were in the hole financially.
Since the 1970s, there have been 20 shutdowns of the federal government. That compares to 0 at the Washington state level, although state lawmakers came close to shutdown a couple of times. Another huge difference, the state legislature has to balance its budget every 2 years. The federal government can run up debt.
I think it was a very good thing that we were required in state government to be more fiscally responsible. That drove a lot of the decisions and a lot of the strategy in order to satisfy that requirement. Not so much here, and it's proven, unfortunately, that we don't have the fiscal discipline to be able to address that. So we've got to take some very, very make some tough decisions in order to keep our country going where we need to.
Congress has allowed our nation's fiscal house to get really out of whack. We have a significant debt problem, and that's a concern in part because it means our country's in the position of borrowing money, sometimes from people who don't necessarily share our interest or countries that don't share our interest. 2, at some point, service on that debt will crowd out other priorities if our nation doesn't get a handle on it.
I was raised in the Washington State Legislature, so I saw how we had to balance a budget, and it was difficult for me here because we don't, so it's a different dynamic. But I understand that dynamic because the federal government has to make sure that the economy doesn't collapse across the country. So we have to have that flexibility within our budget, and if you have a balanced budget and you don't do it appropriately, it can cause severe economic damage. We also have to deal with national disasters. So if you have a balanced budget amendment and you have wildfires in California or an earthquake in Seattle, or damaging floods and storms or tornadoes, you don't have the budgetary capacity to deal with those. So it's a different dynamic. Plus, the federal government has to deal on an international stage. So what happens in other countries' economies or in other, whether it's a war or whether it's security for our nation, we have to deal with our budget in a different capacity.
So some different perspectives there, but one big similarity, the majority of Washington's congressional delegation has served at both the federal level and the state level. So in their words, here's how the two compare and lessons that they've brought from Washington state to Washington, D.C.
In Washington state, we have a very diverse state. Everything from timber counties to high, dense cities that have a lot of economic development, different than even central Washington or eastern Washington. So there's that small diversity that we have to deal with in the state. But at the federal government, much broader.
You don't have to blow it up to a nationwide scale of differences. Actually, a congressional district is large enough that you can see those differences even across the congressional district.
And how do you balance those differing viewpoints and then try to work across the aisle to get things done?
Well, with great difficulty. I have 2 touchstone rules that I actively invite my bosses, as I refer to them, my constituents, to hold me accountable for. I don't promise to be perfect in this regard, but I promise that these are the things I remind myself of often that are important to me. And they're twofold. Number 1, always be civil. There's really no reason to be personally insulting or to demean another person's character. And number 2, always look for common ground. You would be amazed at the number of things you can find in common with people, especially, for example, at the committee level, but also beyond that, where you may disagree with them on 99% of the rest of the issues before you. But if you look for that one thing, it's very powerful.
For me, it comes down to relationships. And you have people serving here in Congress as well as those that were serving in the state legislature who were looking to build those relationships, find issues that you can work together on. And it's been a priority for me to do that. I found in Congress, you do it just a little different because of the size and the magnitude of the issues on which we're working. You build relationships with the people that you serve on a committee, and oftentimes you can find some common ground on the committee and move something forward. And in fact, there's more that is passed bipartisan than often is highlighted.
You know, if you looked at legislative time like a pie chart, I would say the vast majority of the legislative time when I was in Olympia and when Dan was in Olympia was spent on trying to solve big problems. And sometimes there were differences on how to solve those big problems, but by and large, you were working on issues of substance in a constructive way. A decent chunk of the pie was on sort of suspension bills, things that were non-controversial, but important to somebody, some member or their constituents. And then a pretty small fraction of the pie was spent on political bull. I think those slices of the pie are really out of whack in our nation's capital. You see a lot more emphasis on political bull, where votes are taken that seem more designed to make a political statement than to make a law. And what gets crowded out is constructive progress on actually big problems that need to be solved.
Congressman Kilmer and Newhouse say they're trying to change that. They even hosted a bipartisan civility tour in the fall of 2018, visiting each other's districts in Washington state.
If I could quote a really good friend of mine, in order to know where someone's coming from, you should see where they actually are coming from. Derek said that during the trip. And
he got tired of me saying it, I think.
Well, I was able to memorize it. But it was absolutely true. We have some similarities in our district, but we found that there's probably more similarities than there are differences. And even though we're on different sides of the aisle, I think a lot of the challenges we face and the things that we're trying to accomplish as far as legislatively, I think are very similar. What I've always thought about this whole experiment that we are in, which people sometimes describe our government, is this is truly a people business. We are representing human lives here in Congress. And that many of the solutions that we need to find, that we need to seek after, should not are not partisan in nature. They're just trying to do the right thing for people who are trying to make a living, trying to raise their families. And we find that that's I think, the biggest similarity between a Democrat and a Republican district.
While the year got off to a rough start, the question moving forward, can lawmakers and the White House compromise and work together to address the big issues, especially amid the politics of a year running up to 2020? We are going to be tracking that very question from this Washington, following your Congress members, their ideas, and their attempts to get legislation passed. Jennifer?
Thanks, Natalie. When we come back, we will look at the state perspective regarding legislative priorities here and the impact that decisions in D.C. have on our state. Washington to Washington continues in a moment. Welcome back from Olympia. Washington state lawmakers have been in session since January 14th, and this year Democrats hold a majority in both the House and Senate. Senate Democrats gained control last year from Republicans. We sat down recently with legislative leaders from both parties to discuss priorities and comparisons with the other Washington.
Really historic voting access.
First in the Senate, Senate Majority Leader Andy Billig and Republican Floor Leader Shelley Short.
The big issues that we'll be looking at is investing in mental health. We want to also really address the housing crisis, and we've created a new committee, the Housing Affordability and Stability Committee, for the first time.
Affordable housing, available housing, we've got a lot of proposals out there to do different things, hopefully different tools for local governments and for builders and developers. But it's also, we need to make sure that we're encouraging business in the state and not running business or jobs out. And so the tax pieces, generally we don't support tax increases as Republicans. We think that from a budgetary standpoint, we've got enough money to develop the kind of budget to do the priorities that we need to. So we're going to work together, but there are definitely going to be some differences along the way.
What about those differences? Some of Washington's congressional delegations say that deep divisions in D.C. can cause issues to become combative. Lawmakers in Olympia often say they agree on 80% of the issues, but it's that last 20% where differences can be pretty stark. The trick is managing relationships.
The one thing that surprised me when I was first elected is that you can have those very vigorous disagreements on the floor, but at the end of the day, you might be working with those same individuals on legislation you care about or you both care about.
I remember one time I was making a speech on this bill. It was very important about campaign finance reform, which is an area I've worked in. And I made a comment that Senator Patton thought was over the line. And I said something like, if you're for this, if you vote against this bill, it's a vote for dark money or something like that. He stood up and yelled, point of order, objection. I mean, he was so red in the face. And we're at opposite ends of the political spectrum, but we've gotten to be good friends because we live in sort of neighboring districts. And it was as mad as I had ever seen him. And right after that, after everything kind of calmed down, he came up to me and goes, Andy, hey, that really, I didn't appreciate that comment, but I might have overreacted. And there we were a few minutes later that we're back to where we were before as friends.
But that there's passion in these arguments as well. For the 2019 session, leaders on both sides of the aisle say the budget, education, mental health, and homelessness are all top priorities. And Governor Inslee has again proposed an aggressive legislative agenda on climate issues. Democrats and Republicans, of course, have differences in what the best solutions are. In the State House, Majority Leader Pat Sullivan and Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox see more differences than similarities between the work they're doing in the Washington legislature and what's happening in Congress.
I think they're far different. I think, the issues get more local as you get more local. And, here in the state of Washington, we take care of the things that we need to take care of here, whether it's a transportation and operating budget, capital budget, then just the issues are state oriented. And, they have a different slate of issues over in Washington, D.C.
It's true that a lot of the dollars that we spend come from the feds, so we have some commonality there too. I think one of the big differences is they seem to be trapped in a place in D.C. where they lead with the differences, and we know that we're going to have differences and they're going to get sharp and bitter sometimes, but I think we really do try hard to lead with what we have in common too.
How in a legislature where the Democrats control both houses and the governorship, how do you ensure that your voice as a Republican gets heard? And how do you ensure as Democrats that you're listening to other voices and other viewpoints?
I think you'll see different dynamics around every bill. There are times where I think we're more aligned with the House Republicans than we are with the Senate Democrats, and that does happen on occasion.
I've been floor leader for the House Republicans for 6 years, and so that means that I'm responsible for herding the cats that all have an equal right to hold that microphone and express their opinion. And the way that government is set up is really designed to facilitate the majority winning, but also facilitate that the minority is always heard. And I've always, although when I came in I didn't understand how important process was, I have learned that one of my primary duties is to stand up for a fair process that sometimes gets in the way of efficiency, but ensures that the majority has to hear what we have to say.
Given what we see happening in D.C., how do you set a different tone? How do you work towards common ground?
We all are drawn to represent our districts and to give our people a voice. But I think the best way you give a voice to the people we represent and to the state is to work with each other and to determine where we can, take an issue or a position or look at that amendatory language. It ends up being better.
We have to remember we're here to work on behalf of the whole state. And I really appreciate when we're in this chamber that around the rim of this chamber are the names of all 39 counties. And I think that our predecessors who built this building did that very much on purpose to say, you're supposed to work together, you're supposed to work on behalf of the whole state. And I love that reminder in this chamber.
In Washington, D.C., Congress broke records this year for the number of women in office, 25 in the Senate and 102 House members. Here in Olympia, about 40% of Olympia lawmakers are women, the fourth highest in the nation. We recently sat down with two of those women, House Majority Floor Leader Monica Stonier, a Democrat, and Senate Republican Leader Shelley Short. We talked inside the newly built Helen Summers Building, the first building on the Capitol campus named after a female lawmaker. We asked them about what it means to have more women in the State House, the impacts of the Me Too movement, their political differences, and the future of women leadership in both houses.
Fun to do this
I
with
know.
you. I know, this is cool.
We served in the House a while back.
We did.
Together.
We did.
She sat right across the aisle from me.
And now different chambers, right?
I look at the historic nature. You know, when I look at my mom, they didn't encourage women to work outside of the home. And if they did, and you were young, you never got those job opportunities because people just felt you were going to just stay home and raise a family, right? And so when I look at her, not lack of opportunity, she had different choices. And then I see what we're doing today, what I'm doing, and really what any woman can do.
Part of, I think, what we're seeing now is the hard work that many women in politics before I came have put in to try and pave that pathway and make sure we have, women running for local offices that then have the qualifications and the experience to run for a higher up office down the road. And there's a pipeline there. Everything I look at differently, right? Like how many young girls do we have in the PAGE program? And just really it starts to spill over.
Both women say the Me Too movement has meant new policies and procedures in the House and Senate and new conversations.
I do think the conversation is incredibly different. I mean, even in just what you hear on the radio and how people interact with one another, it's very clear that we have high standards for how we treat one another, and we're going to continue to work on holding those standards and accountability.
I think what the movement has done really, it's about how do we treat people? How do you see a person? Do you see a person to respect that person in their space or what you say? And those things, and I think that benefits us all. Whether we're men or women, you really do need to think, am I making that person uncomfortable? Or is there something that has been said that really bothers someone?
As for the potential for a female Speaker of the House when longtime Speaker Frank Chopp steps down from the speakership later this year,
it's really exciting for me right now. Of the 5, top leadership roles, I'm the only woman in those top 4 roles. So while we have a lot of women in the legislature, we want to make sure we also have women leaders.
We've got a majority of women on our leadership team, in the Senate this year and in the Senate Republicans, and I just feel it's really exciting to see the things that are happening. Increasingly, I feel like we're taken more seriously, and that it's a different feel now, and it's good.
Political differences aside,
at the end of the day, we are put into the legislature, into this place to make decisions and to listen to one another, and you really find you have way more in common.
I think people get tired of being static. Like that's just going to get old after a while, and they're going to have to start looking for some solutions, and I suspect we'll see a lot of women leading the way on those solutions.
Those solutions must involve writing and passing a balanced budget. That's one of the differences between Washington State's legislature and Congress. In the state of Washington, there are 3 budgets: the operating budget, which is the largest, the transportation budget, and the capital budget for building projects. As we learned from Governor Jay Inslee's budget director, David Schumacher, the federal government's budget scenario is a bit more complicated.
The federal government is a very elaborate process. They spread the budget out into numerous subcommittees to pull things together, not just in terms of the dollars, but in terms of the scope. This state budget is much more focused. Every state's a little bit different, but states are required to, for the most part, balance their budgets, and as we know, the federal government does not, for good or bad. There are good reasons that the federal government sometimes will run a deficit, but there are times when deficits become a problem.
And what are those good reasons for running a deficit? Obviously, they have to keep the economy afloat.
Right. The federal government is much larger than state governments, even all state governments combined. In recessions, sometimes government spending or tax cuts are good for the general economy, I think most economists would tell you that it's probably a good thing to run deficits in bad times, and maybe you run surpluses in good times, so that over the long haul things are roughly in balance. But year to year, it's not necessarily the most important thing. The parts of the federal government budget that intersect with the state budget at the big level are pretty stable. The human services is the overwhelming largest, Medicaid being the largest of that. Medicaid is basically a state and federal shared program, roughly half and half. So as long as they have budgets and the money flows, we're not typically scrambling with huge federal budget decisions. Every once in a while there'll be a big policy that'll be wrestled with that would have a big impact, but it's not as though year to year we're scrambling because they're changing the rules all the time. Federal government is big and it moves kind of slow, and we get a pretty good idea of where they're coming.
Washington State has never had a government shutdown, but the state has come close to a partial shutdown as recently as 2017. Thank you for joining us for our inaugural episode of Washington to Washington. We look forward to focusing on the critical issues in this state and talking with the people of Washington who are working toward solutions. And we welcome your feedback on this episode, as well as ideas for future episodes of Washington to Washington. You can hashtag us on social media at WA2WA and share your thoughts.
For now, from Washington, D.C. and from Olympia,
we hope you'll join us next time on Washington to Washington.